Welcome, one and all, to another chapter in the Odyssey of Lowne Aerospace, my new primary save file in which I'm trying to unlock the tech tree again so I can go back to making the epic scale missions you may be used to seeing on this channel. The first episode saw the success of Genesis 3, which carried Bob Kerbin to the surface of Minmus, and you all wrote in the comments that you'd like to see our next endeavour feature a rocket that can carry our courageous Kerbinauts to the Red Planet and back. And so here we are with Genesis 5, the biggest rocket in its class, and packing a payload capable of landing at and charting multiple biomes on Duna, with fuel reserves remaining to stop by Ike, Duna's lone satellite, and an extremely interesting destination in its own right. The first thing we need to do though is set ourselves up so that we're at a Duna transfer window, as in a place where Kerbin and Duna are in the right places so we can easily get an encounter with Duna. So in Kerbal Space Program, this would be, if you look at the map view in the tracking station, if you imagine a line drawn from Kerbin to the Sun and Duna, the angle that that line forms at the point where it meets the Sun needs to be about 45 degrees. In this instance, I just eyeballed it. You can get mods such as Kerbal Alarm Clock, which can do it very precisely. They just tell you what time to warp to, and you can do it. But I just eyeballed it in this case. But that's what we're doing in the tracking station. And here we are in the vehicle assembly building in the construction phase. I'm not going to go too much in depth with the building aspect because I really do feel that part of the satisfaction that KSP can offer is the elation of seeing a rocket that you designed and built yourself carrying out a mission. But I'm hoping that, the footage is at least clear enough that if you don't quite feel confident enough yet to design your own ships, you can play this video at a slower speed or just pause it at the right moments to recreate this yourself. I am using the Making History DLC parts just for the cockpit of the command module and one of the fuel tanks. I think that fuel tank is part of the DLC. But you can easily substitute these with stock parts for the same performance. The ship configuration that we're going to be going for is an Apollo-style setup, which is a first for this series. And what I mean by Apollo-style is that we have a main command module with a super efficient nuclear engine stage in this case that propels the ship around in space, and then we have a separate landing module that contains all of the experiment bays that actually goes down to the surface of Duna and Ike to harvest all of those sweet, sweet science points. Then once the lander has taken samples from enough biomes, it can ditch its auxiliary fuel tanks and parachutes and ascend back to low Duna orbit, where we'll then redock with the mothership, and then, from there the entire assembly will head to Ike, where we can use the last of the lander's fuel reserves to collect data from there before the command pod carries the crew back to Kerbin. We also have that small adapter piece between the Gemini command pod and the liquid fuel tank. We're not actually going to use that for the nuclear stage. That's going to be the fuel reserve for the lander so we can refuel it so it can do Ike. So, that's the rocket. That's the plan. Now let's put that plan to action. How is that for a cheesy transition? So here we are on the launch pad. Not much more to say about that. We can throttle up and launch. But from the launch pad, we're keeping the thrust of the central mainsail engine. We're going to keep that thrust nice and low to allow those 4 solid rocket boosters to do most of the heavy lifting. You'll notice I fitted parachutes to them so that they can in theory be recovered. Unfortunately, I messed up the deployment, so the chutes just get shredded by aerodynamic forces when I jettison them. But hey, the thought was there. Now, just prior to SRB flameout, I'm going to increase the throttle of the central mainsail engine so that our speed is maintained upon SRB detachment. The mainsail will then carry us onto a suborbital trajectory, at which point we'll detach it when it's run out of fuel and deploy the upper skipper stage, which will complete our circularization and then initiate the first of our 2 high-velocity Kerbin escape burns. And here we are deploying it now, and you can see we probably would have been more suited to using a Poodle engine or at least a slightly more vacuum-optimized engine. We are technically still burning it in the atmosphere, but most of the mileage we're getting out of this engine will be done in a vacuum. And as you can see on screen, we have our apoapsis height set at just over 100 kilometers. Kerbin's atmosphere actually ends at 70 kilometers, so in theory we could just circularize with an orbit of that height exactly, but it's very hard to do that without getting your periapsis slightly too low. Having an orbit above that point, and 100 kilometers is definitely above that point, it gives us a little bit of wiggle room in case our orbit isn't quite circular. We've got that big safety zone of 30 kilometers for our periapsis to kind of be fluctuating, and then we won't be hitting Kerbin's atmosphere. This will be especially useful when we do our escape burns from Kerbin, in which that will force our periapsis downwards slightly. It's nice that we've got that safety zone so we don't enter the atmosphere again by accident. And here we are in orbit, and as you can see, we got our ship all configured so that we can rearrange it much like the Apollo missions. If you're not sure what that would have looked like, we will get to that so you can see it. First things first, we can get our solar panels deployed just so we can maximize the amount of solar exposure we can get, and then we're going to go ahead and plot our maneuver node to get to Duna. Now, if you look at the Kerbal Engineer readouts on the left hand side, you can see the thing that says delta V current. That's the amount of delta V we have left in the skipper stage, which has a higher thrust, so it's just easier to use. And you can see we've still got like 732 meters per second, which is quite a lot. So we can use some of that to get to Duna. It's not going to be enough to do the entire burn to get to Duna, so we're going to have to split our burn to Duna over 2 burns. So you can see, first of all, we've made a maneuver node for 1 orbit's time by clicking the little next orbit button, which is one of the 3 buttons that appears when you first create the maneuver node. And then we're going to drag our retrograde marker down and then set it back to this orbit by clicking the other button that says previous orbit, the one that would normally be grayed out unless you pressed next orbit first. Then we're going to drag our retrograde marker so that this burn costs slightly less in terms of delta V expenditure than our current delta V, which you can see on the left hand side of the Kerbal Engineer readouts. So in this case, I've got a burn that's going to be 691.5 meters per second. And then the reason I'm going to go with slightly less than the amount of fuel I actually have left is because I'm going to do another little burn at apoapsis just so we can deorbit the skipper stage so that we don't leave any space junk in Kerbin orbit, because that's one of the changes I want in this save file, is to not have so much junk floating around in space. So for this mission, we're not going to be leaving any debris in deep space, or indeed in orbit around any celestial body. So the reason why we plotted the maneuver node with the skip orbit thing in mind is that now if we create another maneuver node, that would be on our current orbit and we'll be kind of in the right place to get a Duna encounter. It's just easier to do it this way. Sometimes if you just do it by placing 2 maneuver nodes, it can be hard to know whether you're going to be in the right sort of spot to get a good Duna encounter. I don't know if it even makes a difference, to be honest, but this is the way I've always done it. So if you want to do it like I do it, this is how I do it. So that's how you could do it too, but you don't have to. It's a free country. I'm not the police. So now we've got our eccentric orbit and almost completely exhausted the amount of fuel left in this stage. We're going to time warp up to apoapsis, burn retrograde slightly in order to get ourselves on a collision course with Kerbin's atmosphere. And there we go. And then we can detach the lower engine stage and then get ready to reconfigure the main command pod and the lander into their kind of Apollo style arrangement. And then we can commence our second burn that will get us on a trajectory to Duna and get ourselves a Duna encounter. It should be fairly easy if you've got yourself on a Kerbin Duna transfer window, a bit like I showed you at the beginning. If you're not at a good point to get a transfer window, you can always use a mod like Kerbal Alarm Clock just to tell you when to time warp to get a better transfer window available to you. But there is our ship all reconfigured, and we've done a little burn to make sure our periapsis is above the atmosphere line again, and then we can deorbit the skipper stage. As you can see, I was a little bit trigger happy with the time warp when it came to deorbiting the skipper stage, as you can see here. I did have parachutes on there, so we could have landed it in theory, but whatever, I didn't care that much to go back and try and do it again. So with that, it's time to initiate the second of our 2 Kerbin escape high velocity burns that will get us on an encounter with Duna, which, as I say, should be fairly easy to get if you have your transfer window, because Duna it's on a very similar inclination around the sun to Kerbin, so it's actually incredibly easy to encounter. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this point with how abysmal the thrust to weight ratio is for the nuclear engines. They're very heavy and they're pretty weedy when it comes to power, so you can expect very long burn times, as you can see me demonstrating here. The obvious upside to the nuclear engines, and the reason we're using them on this mission, is because of their incredibly high efficiency. I did think about doing this mission with a sort of conventional chemical rocket style engine, maybe even the new Making History Apollo style command pod engine, but I thought it'd be kind of nice to show a nuclear engine as a more sort of traditional method of doing this sort of mission, and I've already used the new engine in the last episode of this series. So now we've got our escape burn all finished and completed, we can take a look at the map screen and we can see that whilst we're getting a Duna encounter, which is what you should probably aim for, I would just aim for getting a random Duna encounter without paying much attention to your actual trajectory past the planet. Then we'll do a relatively cheap burn in interplanetary space to fix our inclination and get ourselves on a trajectory that we're going to be trying to aim for an equatorial flyby of Duna. Obviously we'll be burning at the periapsis point, so it won't be a flyby, but if we weren't going to burn, it would be an equatorial flyby. We also want to make sure that our orbital line is with the rotation of the planet, and by that I mean if you look at the planet's rotation, you want to be passing like passing it with the rotation, not against its rotation, just because it'll make your ascent from the surface with your lander that much more efficient if you're ascending kind of with the direction of the planetary rotation. Whilst it's not as significant as Kerbin's rotational impact, it is still something. So I guess now we're just on the way, and I've kind of already talked about all the things we're about to do in the next few minutes. Let's talk a little bit about Duna. It's the 4th largest planet in the game, and incidentally is the 4th planet from the Sun as well. It's a terrestrial planet and a favourite destination for many players, including myself, and I guess the reason I like it so much is not because of the fact it's a Mars analogue, but also the fact that it has an atmosphere, albeit a thin one, so aircraft and parachutes can be made to work there, as well as the fact that it's very beautiful. You know, you got the bright orange skies and, you know, vast red vistas with lots of canyons and mountains, as well as icy poles to vary up the landscape even further. Now, as you just may have seen on screen, we did have a slight technical hitch on the way. You can see those solar panels, despite saying they are receiving solar energy, they weren't recharging the batteries on the ship, and our electric charge was slowly running out. Luckily, the nuclear engine has an alternator built into it, so when we initiate a burn using that engine, we can regain SAS control for a small amount of time. But as you can see now, the electric charge is starting to fall down again. This is just being caused by mod incompatibility. I have a ton of mods that I didn't bother uninstalling when the game updated to 1.4 because I was just very complacent. But that's why. So what I did, I just Alt F4'd the game quickly, systematically removed all the mods I'm not using, so basically all of them except for Kerbal Engineer, Better Time Warp, and Camera Tools, and the solar panel started working again. So if you're having a similar problem, that's what's caused it. And as you can see, now that we've done that, our electricity regeneration has been restored. So I was talking about Duna, wasn't I? So yeah, it's beautiful, it's a really nice place to go, but it's also really good for beginners, and that's because not only does it require a comparatively very small amount of fuel to reach, it's fairly large, so its sphere of influence is quite an easy thing to encounter, and like I said earlier, in addition to this, its orbit is on a similar inclination to Kerbin, so it's very easy to get an encounter. And should you end up using too much fuel on the way, or you didn't add enough fuel tank or something like that, you can actually capture, circularize, and land for barely any fuel expenditure as well, due to the fact that you can aerobrake in its atmosphere. But unlike places like Jool, Kerbin, Eve, and Lathe, the atmosphere of Duna is very, very thin, so it's incredibly hard to overheat upon re-entry. On the downside, it's hard to land on Duna with parachutes alone due to the slimness of its atmosphere, and, you know, while the mountains and canyons are certainly impressive, they can pose quite the threat to landers due to their steepness. That's why in this mission, we're going to be aiming for flatter areas, but in scenarios where landing on an inclination is unavoidable, because we're going to be going for multiple biomes, I've purposely designed the lander to have quite a broad base and quite a low centre of gravity in order to ensure that tipping over upon touchdown won't occur. This was an issue with the Genesis 3 and especially the Genesis 4 Mun rocket, although that was a direct ascent rocket, so the lander was going to have to be bigger. And since Genesis 5 poses a much more challenging mission, I wanted to ensure that we wouldn't run the risk of rolling at all. So as I said earlier, you can do an aerobrake in order to capture at Duna if you want. We have easily enough fuel in this nuclear transfer stage to avoid doing that, just for the sake of, it just feels a little bit more realistic to do a capture burn rather than an aerobrake. But you're quite free to use the atmosphere to save some fuel if you want to. You can do that. So the best way to pick out landing spots for the purpose of farming science from different locations is to first of all find an interesting geographical feature. In this case, I'm going to be aiming for this canyon here. It's a near guarantee that the canyon will be its own biome, and then what we'll be doing, we'll be coming in flying over the top of it. So before Bob can embark on his descent, he can first do some science from space near Duna in order to rack up those points. You may have seen me do it earlier when we first entered Duna's sphere of influence. We did all our science experiments. Just the purpose of this mission to get science points, so you can get science from space near and high above a planet or moon, so it's always good to get those done in case you forget later. And then of course we can do our deceleration burn and get ourselves, well, let me just walk you through what I'm thinking. The plan is to just overshoot the canyon and end up on the far side. This far side will be its own biome as well, be it Highlands, Midlands Sea, etc, etc. So we can take some science from there, and then we can just hop down into the canyon itself and repeat our experiments again. Now, during our initial descent, we're going to keep an eye out on Kerbal Engineer Redux, you can see at the top there. Or alternatively, if you don't have it installed or you're playing on console, you can run experiments that will inform you which biome you're in and just sort of reset them rather than take the data. And as we fly over during our ascent before we reach the canyon, we'll be able to see which biomes kind of surround the canyon and whereabouts they are. In this case, I saw that on the other side of the canyon, from where we'll be landing, there's a Midland Sea and a Midlands biome as well. so we'll be able to visit those once we've charted the canyon and the far side biome. The far side biome, which in this case is the highlands. So, like I say, Duna has a thin, but it is an atmosphere nonetheless. We can deploy some drogue chutes to bleed off a lot of our initial speed, and then we can deploy our main chutes to slow ourselves down to almost safe landing speeds. Not quite slow enough. We will have to do some burns just to do our final touchdown. We can do some brave EVAing as well. Luckily the atmosphere is quite thin that Kerbals can easily hold onto a ladder during descents, although with parachutes that's pretty safe no matter where you are. Just do some sides because you can get EVA reports from flying above a surface, so we can do that on EVA. And then we can touch down using a little bit of engines to get our final bit of speed killed off. Small bounce, but other than that, I think it was pretty good. And then we can use action groups 1 and 2. I like to bind the Science Junior and Mystery Goo to a separate one just because there's a delay when you hit the Science feeder. So it just, I don't know. I guess it's just my OCD at that point. So yeah, we can do that. Take all the data, restore the Mystery Goo and Science Junior bays, and do the most important thing of this mission, which is, of course, plant a flag. Although that does actually serve a bit of importance, like I said in the earlier videos of this series, I actually like using the flags to mark out the biomes I visited. There we go. So you can see that one said Highlands, just so if I'm being lazy and want to just land somewhere I've not got science from just yet, I can quickly check the map screen, see what the names of the flag sites are so I know which biomes to avoid if I want to get the most science available. And then of course we can take a surface sample as well. In terms of experiment hierarchy, it's the surface sample that will net us the most science for all the parts of this mission, so you should prioritize that. The next biggest science generator is the Science Junior unit, which gets us 200 science points pop, although it is a very big thing and it can be quite challenging to incorporate it into a lander design. The other science experiments aren't actually that far off in terms of how much science they can provide, so don't worry too much if you can't find an elegant way to incorporate a Science Junior into your capsule. It can be particularly difficult to add the materials bay without making your lander quite top heavy, but since you won't be losing out too much if you bring every other experiment type with you, it doesn't matter a great deal. Obviously you'll be losing points, but if you'd rather just, save a little bit of, weight and, make the lander look a bit nicer, it's not a huge sacrifice to not have that. But for completeness sake, I built one into this lander here. For those who may not know, if you have a scientist Kerbal like Bob here, you can use the Science Junior and Mystery Goo units as many times as you want, because the scientists can clean out the bays for reuse. That's why I've been using Bob on pretty much every mission of this series, because Bob can use the Science Junior and Mystery Goo units an infinite number of times. He can also repack the chute, which I thought was just a thing engineers could do. Apparently you can do it with scientists as well. Maybe it's a career mode thing because I'm a scrub that plays science mode, or so commenters keep telling me. So we can repack the chute, and that just saves us a bunch of fuel when it comes to landing in the other biomes. It means we can, really minimize the amount of engine burning we're doing in between biomes. I did actually, in one of the drafts of this mission, this thing actually had a detachable rover that had all the science units on it, and the Kerbal could just drive around the biomes in order to save on engine fuel. But rovers in this game are just so terrible. They control really, really badly, especially in Duna's very thin gravity, and it just became so infuriating. I thought, no, I'll have to just be using so many quick saves throughout the whole thing. It just won't be fun. So I went for this solution instead. So squad, if you're listening, please fix. I mean, it could just be my incompetence at designing rovers. Let's face it, that's always a possibility when it comes to my issues I have with this game. So at this point in the mission, we really hit a low point. But don't worry, it's a literal low point, not a metaphorical one. God, that was awful. Because we're at the base of the canyon, which is the lowest point they're going to be reaching. We're then going to be rescaling the other side of the canyon and going to the other two biomes that I saw during our descent, so we can plant our flag, get our signs, and then be on our way. I'm kind of showing this in relatively abridged format, not only because I don't want this mission to go on too long, but also I was trying to be quite hasty at the time, because this is where I have it's not a confession, it's just a story that was really annoying at the time. And that is that I filmed this mission, I did the entire thing, I imported all the files into Sony Vegas on Sunday night ready to edit, and I noticed that all of the footage after the first touchdown in the Highlands at the very beginning of our Duna mission, when we touched down in the Highlands, there was a stealth edit there, because what I did was when I looked at the footage, I realised that all the footage following that moment was corrupted, as in it either looked very, very blurry, pixelated and glitchy, or just a complete black screen and only audio recorded. I don't know why this happened. This is just sometimes Shadowplay does this to me. It just doesn't like me, I think. So I had to basically, at 11:30, and on Sunday night, on a school night no less, so before work, I had to basically redo the entire mission from this point here. So everything I actually did, I would try to be quite fast in order to get this done and be ready to have it done for next week, because most of my time spent during the week these days is working, but also I've got an exam on April the 18th, and a lot of my free time is spent revising for this exam. It's 2 exams. One of them is a disgusting 3-hour-long written paper, and the other one is a practical exam which live patients come in. They're called OSCEs. They're horrible things. So that's kind of what I was doing there. But that's the story of why you may see it look like I was rushing as I was recording this. It's because I was getting impatient. But whatever. So here we are, just sort of getting back on the pod after chartering the Midland Sea biome, and hang on guys, I can just hear my fax machine going off. What's this? I've received some of the data from the labs, and we can have a look at it now. This is terrible. Now we can use our atmospheric analysis experiments to learn more about this mysterious planet's skies. It's a cold and thin atmosphere that extends to 50 kilometers by the looks of things, 20 kilometers short of Kerbin. I'm trying to do this like in character, like I didn't know this before. Not only is it lower than Kerbin's, it's also 1/15th the mass and surface pressure, and 1/9th the surface density. The sea level pressure on Duna, as in where the pressure is the highest, is the equivalent to being 15 kilometers above the surface on Kerbin, to give you a kind of idea of how they compare, with the pressure at the top of Duna's highest mountain being only 2.4 kilopascals. Now looking at these reports here, whilst the science messages that you're seeing on the in-game experiments, they don't really inform us of too much, these scientists back at Mission Control have just faxed me to inform me that the average molecular weight of the air that we got from the science experiments that we've been doing here is 42 grams per mole, and its adiabatic index is 1.20. While we don't know what elements comprise its atmosphere for sure, these elements would suggest that it's comprised mainly of carbon dioxide. So let's take a look at our temperature gauges as well. Our temperature gauges are telling us that the average datum level temperature of Duna, which is the, theoretically the best, or the highest I should say, is around minus 23 degrees Celsius, or minus 9.4 Fahrenheit for our American peers. This drops to minus 123 degrees Celsius. We ascend into the isothermal layer between 30 and 45 kilometers. And what's interesting is that Duna itself actually has no seasons, due to the fact that it doesn't have an axial tilt. So this temperature doesn't really vary throughout the year. The poles at Duna can see temperatures as low as minus 90 degrees Celsius, and here we can see Bob enjoys a nice stroll through this freezing toxic wind as he plants the flag of the final biome we'll be visiting, and of course taking our surface sample as well. And then we can pretty much think about ascending from Duna. So first thing we can do is detach the parachutes to save a little bit of weight, and we're also going to activate those central fuel tanks as well, which were currently deactivated, so we'd be only draining fuel from the detachable auxiliary tanks, but we don't have enough fuel left in those for our actual Duna ascent, so we need all the tanks active for the actual climb. So what I did was I set the fuel priority of the central tanks to be slightly higher than the fuel priority for the peripheral tanks. What that means is that the engine will drain the side tanks first without touching the fuel contacts of the central ones, and then once the side tanks are emptied, it will then start feeding from the central tank, and obviously we can detach the auxiliary ones at that point. And in case you're wondering how I've been able to do this, I've set the decouplers there to have crossfeed enabled so that fuel can be transferred between the two stages, or kind of two parts of the craft. And well, that's how you do asparagus staging, things like that. Well, this isn't asparagus staging, this is technically called onion staging, but that's how you can do that kind of selective fuel tank, fuel pumping staging without the use of the fuel lines. But there we are, we have a beautiful apoapsis height just above the Kármán line, or the atmospheric lines. We can do a burn at apoapsis to increase our horizontal speed and get ourselves circularized. And as you can see from our total delta V, it was very, very tight in terms of budget. As I said before, this is the second time I did this mission. The first time I did it, I actually had a lot more fuel left over, so I obviously didn't do a very good job for this ascent just here, but it was enough. All we needed to do was get into orbit. We can do the actual docking procedure using the mothership with Jebediah at the helm, and we can dock with our lander and get ourselves on a course for Ike. We don't need the landing legs or the side tanks for Ike because it's much, much lower gravity, so we don't really need the landing legs or the extra fuel to land on it. And it saves a bit of weight. And obviously we don't require the parachute modules because Ike has no atmosphere. Okie dokie, so I haven't really talked too much about the docking procedure because this video really isn't here to serve as a docking tutorial. I highly recommend Scott Manley's docking tutorial if you want to get better at rendezvous, or check out my own docking tutorial in which I basically show you how to do an Apollo style Minmus mission. It's kind of done in a similar way. You just create a maneuver node with a mothership and, you know, play around with retrograde, prograde, radial in, radial out, normal and anti-normal until you can kind of force your target nodes to be closer and closer together. If you can't get it that close, don't worry, I wasn't that close either, to be fair. You just kind of get as close as you can, burn retrograde relative to the target on the nav ball, and then just burn towards the target, and just rinse and repeat, kind of burn towards the target, get close, burn retrograde, kill your speed relative to the target, then burn towards it again, so on, so on, so on, until you get nice and close. Now, as you can see, I don't have any monopropellant on board either the lander or the mothership, and that's because it's really easy to dock without monopropellant. I'm going to show you how. So make sure both objects are going 0 meters per second relative to each other on the nav ball, then have one of them target the docking port of the other, switch to the other vessel and do the same thing, so target the docking port of the one you want to dock with, and then when you do, you just hit point at target on the nav ball autopilot thing, and even when you're controlling one ship, the other one will naturally continue to face your target even if you're not directly controlling it. So it's just super easy. So as you drift together, both ships will continually fix their alignment, so you just dock with the docking ports nicely. It might not have been particularly easy to appreciate this because I was quite close to begin with and I was already kind of pointing in the kind of right direction, but I believe for the docking of the Ike section of this mission, it was a little bit rougher because it was getting later and later on in the evening. I really needed to get it done so I could go to bed. So I was a little bit rougher with that docking, so you can probably get a better sense of kind of the effectiveness of this strategy later on. But people have noticed my ships doing this in the past. We're like, why is his other ship still kind of steering itself to enable better docking? That's how. You just use the autopilot of the nav ball. It's not a mod. I think you'll have to have some upgrades if you're playing career mode, but in science and sandbox mode, which are the only two modes I've played, to be honest, you can do it from the get-go. Unless, of course, it's a probe and you've got no connection to the Kerbin Space Center. Other than that, you pretty much are good. And now we are Ike bound, and let's talk about Ike. You may or may not have noticed just how massive Ike is. It's smaller than the Mun, but it's bigger than Minmus. It's somewhere between the Mun and Minmus in terms of size. The closest thing in the solar system to Ike size is probably Dres. That's just ever so slightly bigger. But the thing is, with Ike, I'm comparing its size to Duna, and when you compare its size to Duna, it's the biggest planetary satellite relative to the size of its parent. This is in contrast to Phobos and Deimos, which are the satellites of Mars in the real world. You know, because although Duna is meant to be the in-game analog for Mars in KSP, Ike doesn't seem, like I say, it's not very similar to Phobos or Deimos at all, which are much, much smaller when compared to Mars' size. I mean, in the real solar system, it's the moon of Earth that's very, very large compared to its parent. But really, in the real solar system, no moon has a mass as similar to its parent body as Ike. So, little interesting tidbit about that. Another thing that's interesting about Ike is the fact that it's tidally locked to Duna, which means that only one side of Ike ever faces Duna. It's a bit like how Lathe is tidally locked to Jool, which someone on the subreddit actually pointed out that if a civilization lived on Lathe, they could theoretically never know about Jool if they never sailed to the other side of the planet, which is kind of a cool thing to think about. But to Ike's the same. It's also incredibly easy to get an encounter with Ike, as you may have seen me getting one earlier, because Ike has a massive sphere of influence, because, like I say, it's a very large body, and it's very, very close to Duna, so it doesn't take very much at all to get an Ike encounter. It's also very, very close to being in a geostationary orbit around Duna, as in, an orbit where your orbital speed is the same as the planet's rotation. So you can't get into a geostationary orbit around Duna, basically, because although you can, Ike will very quickly suck you up and destroy you. So unfortunately, you can't really do a geostationary relay network around Duna, at least not a permanent one. In terms of its topography, it's very, very hilly, very mountainous. There's a few mountain ranges you can go and visit. And in this case, I'm doing a similar thing I did with the Duna landing site. I basically picked out like a geographical feature using the map screen and landed, kind of watched the Kerbal Engineer readouts as I descended, just keeping an eye out for the biomes nearby and trying to land somewhere near the border between two. So I actually got lucky and did it the first time. I was braced with quick saves in case I needed to redo the descent, but I didn't need to in the end. You want to be quite close because we've only got just over 1,000 meters per second delta V, and for Ike it takes 390 meters per second-ish to get into orbit again from the surface, so we really don't have that much fuel to play around with, so we don't want to be spending too much transferring between biomes. So we only really have enough fuel to get to 2 biomes. I did attempt to do like a thing where I noticed this is a round vessel, right? So I did try rolling it down a hill, a bit like a rover, but that went about as well as you'd expect it to, so I didn't do that in the end. So we just visited 2 biomes. I went for this mountain range, and then we did the Midlands, which is just to the west of it. But I thought, just before we leave the Midlands, why not spend a little bit more time on Ike? Because the jetpack here is very, very effective on Ike because it has such low gravity. I mean, the jetpack's really good for Duna. Let's face it, you can get quite far on Duna with the jetpack. So imagine for a moment how far you could get with the jetpack on Ike. And in this case, I kind of knew that there was a lowlands biome slightly to the west of the Midlands because I saw it on the descent. I knew I wouldn't have enough fuel to get the ship over there, so we couldn't take any of the experiments with us. But we can go there and get a surface sample, which, as I said at the earlier in this video, is the kind of, it nets the most science points out of all the others. So we can do a EVA report from the lowlands and take a surface sample, so we get a nice chunk of extra science we wouldn't have got otherwise. I could have done even more. I could have got even more biomes done, but to be honest, we're pretty good in terms of science on this mission. I don't want this video to drag out too much longer than it needs to be. So without further ado, we can time accelerate kind of to a place where we can get into orbit, but I noticed that our mothership's actually going to be fairly it's not in an equatorial orbit, and we don't have that much fuel left in this lander, so I wanted to try and be as efficient as possible, so I had to go for a perfectly equatorial orbit along the 90-degree vector, so we wouldn't be at the right inclination to dock with the mothership. So much like the Duna Ascent, the actual rendezvous procedure will be done with the mothership. And like I said, I think if memory serves me right, the docking was a little bit rougher around the edges because it was getting later on in the evening, so you'll get a better sense of what I was talking about earlier in terms of how you dock with that monopropellant. Get each ship to target the other one's docking port and then set both of them to auto-target each other using the navball autopilot, pressing the little target vector, and that makes docking a real breeze. But yeah, you're also getting a good demonstration of what I call the lazy method docking, which again I did touch upon earlier, but only to really complement my otherwise fairly efficient method. This time it was pretty rough. I had a separation of nearly 7 kilometers for the ships, but again, you just get as close as you can, burn retrograde relative to the target on the navball, and you can see in no time at all, just by alternating between retrograde and toward the target, all of this, keeping it relevant to the relative to the target using the navball. Wait, see what it says? Target 9.4 meters per second there. Doing that, burning retrograde relative to the target, then burning towards the target. And now we can do the little trick where you have to double click on the docking port to make the ship target a specific part. So you see that, to double click that, that's what makes the game target the specific piece. Auto target, then we're going to burn towards each other. And as you can see, this is not a very good show. We are on time warp, so as soon as we drop out of time warp, the ships will start responding again. Now, as you can see, I didn't even do anything just then. Keep dropping out of time warp, and they just keep on orienting to face each other. So it's fine. As you can see, it's ridiculously easy to dock now. I don't know how long this has been a feature in the game. I feel like it's not always been a feature, but whatever. And as I mentioned earlier, right in the construction phase of this video, I had that adapter tank between the Gemini pod and the liquid fuel tank. That's just there to kind of serve as a refueling station for the lander, but it didn't have enough fuel left in it to do another Ike landing, so we can just get rid of all the excess oxidizer to maximize the delta V left in the interplanetary transfer stage before abandoning our lander. Well, we're not going to abandon it because, unfortunately, like I said at the beginning of this video, I don't want to be really leaving any kind of space junk floating around, so that does unfortunately mean that this lander, it's got to go, I'm afraid. It has served us well. Bob gets out for an emotional EVA as he says his goodbyes. So this it's kind of cool in a way, because that command pod on the lander is meant to be a Mercury replica, and the one on the left, the one in the main mothership, is meant to be a Gemini pod. So it's kind of cool seeing kind of the scale of the Mercury capsule versus the Gemini capsule. Obviously, in real life, the Gemini was the next step up from the Mercury pod. The Gemini being able to seat 2 astronauts, the Mercury only being able to seat 1, with the next tier up obviously being the Apollo capsule, which seated 3. So now we've taken all the science from the lander, we've dumped all our excess oxidizer that we can't use into its tanks, we can burn retrograde around Ike and allow the lander to crash into the rocky surface, and you kind of hear a faint explosion in the background, possibly, depending on how low your volume is at the moment. So now we need to think about getting back to Kerbin, and we can do this in one of two ways. In my hyper-efficient SSTO videos, or videos in which I'm trying to be efficient in general, and what I would recommend to people who want to try and play the game, air quotes, properly, you would wait for an appropriate Duna to Kerbin transfer window. You can do this on the KSP OLEX calculator, which is an online tool. If you Google kind of KSP transfer window planner, or use things like Kerbal alarm clock again to plot a suitable transfer window, you can get back really efficiently. However, I kind of just wanted to get back. I didn't want to leave, I didn't want Jebediah and Bob to be stuck in space too long. Can you imagine Jeb having to share with Bob all that amount of time? So I decided to brute force an encounter with Kerbin. You can see I could easily do this because I have 2,437 meters per second of fuel remaining, which it's too much, really. I didn't need anywhere near that close. So we have a lot of fuel to play around with. As you can see, I'm easily able to get an encounter with Kerbin directly from Duna at quite a big expense. But again, it wasn't, relative to how much fuel we have left over, it's not really that expensive at all. And it means that we can get to Kerbin, whilst it's going to cost us more fuel to get back to Kerbin, it's ultimately going to be much, much faster to get back to Kerbin. So it's very important on the way that we got our science from high above Ike and high above Duna and from interplanetary space before we did this, because obviously we've dumped the lander now and that had all of our science equipment on it. So it's make sure that you did that if you're going to be ditching the lander like I did. Although technically I guess we didn't need to, because as I said, we have surplus Delta V, but whatever, let's move on. And there we have our Kerbin encounter. So kind of went for a rough encounter. Then you can drop the thrust limiter of the nuclear engine if you want to be really efficient and accurate, and get ourselves nice and close to Kerbin's surface. Not too close though, because although we have an ablative shield, and we have a full ablative shield as well, I didn't reduce it to save mass, we should be fairly resilient when it comes to withstanding re-entry heating. There you go, just dropping down the thrust limiter. Yeah, we should be fairly resilient to re-entry heating, but even just like if we just plop straight into the atmosphere like directly vertically, we will still overheat and explode. So you want to be kind of still have a relatively shallow re-entry course into the planet, but like I say, the ablative shields are very, very powerful in this game, so it's not a huge problem if we didn't do that. I guess I could have talked about how I actually got my Kerbin encounter from Duna. Essentially, I just made a maneuver node from Ike that, kind of put that predicted dotted line around Duna, and then I created a maneuver node on that forecasted trajectory, and put a node at periapsis, dragged out prograde, and then just played around with normal, anti-normal, retrograde, and prograde, and just trying to force those grey targets and ship indicators together in order to get our Kerbin encounter. There wasn't really a lot to it. If you just keep playing around with it, you'll eventually get it too, and that's how I did it. I just played around with it until I got what I wanted. So yes, now we're obviously at Kerbin. We can brace ourselves for re-entry heating. So we can use the last of our fuel, I guess, to burn retrograde and kill off as much speed as we can before finally hitting the atmosphere, making sure that we've detached the nuclear stage before we do so we don't have any fireworks a little bit too close for comfort. But we're circularized around Kerbin. Well, we're captured around Kerbin. We didn't quite kill off enough speed to fully get to the point where we'd be landing, so we had to do a second pass. Almost crackened it by having physical time warp on a bit too high. I'm using the mod better time warp for some aspects of this video, which is how I'm able to get physical time warp faster than ×4. It can be very glitchy, and you may inadvertently summon the Kraken by doing this, so definitely use that at your own risk. As you saw there, I nearly messed things up on the final straight. But now we are on the final straight, or drop, I guess. We can just sit back, relax. Well, it did take a while to fall to the ocean, so I'll probably just fast forward through this bit. And there we are, splashed down from our conquest to Duna, which I would call a raging success. But let's recover the vessel, see how much science we got, and then we can determine whether or not it was a success. So we can hit recover, and look at that. This mission has netted us a whopping 10,617 units of science, and if we open the R&D building, we can see that this is pretty much enough to finish unlocking the tech tree we can just go through all the branches here. We've got all the big fuel tanks now. We've got the structural pieces. We've got all the adapter parts. We have even the space plane components as well. Get the big rover wheels as well, so we can start building roving bases again. That was a cool little thing I did in the last series. It feels like I'm really bragging. I'm not now. That's just a thing I was really proud of in that last series. And then we can get to the final tier, which is the really expensive stuff. We get the big thermoelectric generator, which is always useful. And then we can unlock the rapier, and it would appear that we are 43 science units short. So I guess we're not quite at the end of this series yet. I guess we could get that science from just wandering around the Kerbal Space Center, but that's no fun. So I think we'll have to be doing one more video in this series to finalize our tech tree, and then we can really say that the space program is off the ground, both literally and kind of, metaphorically from a video standpoint. So looks forward to that. I don't really know where I'm going to go yet. Maybe Eve. I don't know. We'll decide. I mean, I went to Eve fairly recently, so maybe not Eve, but somewhere. I'll go somewhere. But on screen, top left is a link to the full playlist. Top right was specially chosen for you by YouTube's algorithm, and bottom right was just my most recent upload. So other than that, if you want to join my Discord, you can. It's in the description, as well as a link to my Twitter to keep up with all the latest memes and updates and things like that. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can as well. That is also in the description. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.